Good evening. I'm Norman Fraser from Christchurch, Ewell, and I'd like to welcome you warmly to this seasonal Zoom event organised by 7 churches in South London and North Surrey. We're aiming to keep our meeting to about an hour this evening, and the evening will consist of a bit of interviewing, a couple of short presentations, but mostly it's going to be about your questions. On your screen, you can see a button that says chat. On my screen, it's in the bottom center, though it might be somewhere else on yours. Just look for that word chat. And if you want to ask a question, just press that chat button and type in what you want to ask, and it will be sent through. You can post your questions anytime from now and all the way throughout the meeting. The more, the better. You control the direction our meeting takes, so please don't hold back. Now I'd like to hand over to our host for the evening, Carl Laferton.
Hello everyone, my name's Carl. I'm at Grace Church, Worcester Park, and I work at the Good Book Company. You can see some of our luxurious offices just behind me. I'm the kind of Graham Norton / Emily Maitlis kind of role this evening. It's my job to ask your questions, but mainly to help us all really to listen to Peter. So Peter, thanks for being with us this evening. Just before we start, this is sort of show us your medals bit. So obviously you've got a lot of colour coordinated books, but tell us a bit more about who you are, where you are, what you do.
Yes, well, the colour-coordinated books are because I'm in part of a library of Tinderhouse, Britain's largest library of the Bible. I have the privilege of heading up a research centre on the Bible, and that's what I do.
Great. So you're also an author. Tell us a bit about that, and tell us a bit about your family as well.
I've written a couple of best-selling books. So one of them is called Studies in the Syntax of the Peshitta of 1 Kings. Another one was Early Syriac Translation Technique and the Textual Criticism of the Greek Gospels. They'll be in cinemas near you quite soon. But I did actually write something that was readable. So those other books have been read by 2 people maybe. But I wrote something called Can We Trust the Gospels? And my answer is yes on that. But that's really genuinely accessible, read by teenagers even.
Great. Though you have given away it's sort of a spoiler alert there that you didn't give us, because you've told us what the answer is already. But tonight we're thinking about, is the Nativity nonsense? And I suppose that's a great question, because when I look at the Bible and start reading the Christmas accounts, the Christmas account in the book of Luke, for example, straight away, at the very beginning of it, there's an angel visiting a woman and telling her that despite the fact that she's a virgin, she is going to be pregnant. And as a 21st century thinking person, immediately in the first few sentences of the account, I've got at least 2 big problems. So what I'd love you to do, Peter, just for 5, maybe 10 minutes, is just take us through why you, as a clearly pretty clever guy with a lot of colour coordinated books and a couple of books that you've authored whose names I didn't even understand, why you think that the Nativity isn't nonsense.
Right, well, thank you for asking that, and I hope you don't mind if I share screen to do this. So yes, is the Nativity nonsense? I tried to find the most ridiculous Christmas card picture that I could, and there we got some palm trees, I think a snowy hillside, fairly light blue skies because it's the middle of the day, there's indoor lighting, and there's a big star overhead. And of course there's a lot of stuff we do at Christmas time that is sentimental and in logical ways nonsensical. So if that's what we're talking about with the Nativity, we might well say, well, yes, it is nonsense. But when I'm talking about the Nativity, I'm seeking to follow what is talked about in the Bible stories of Jesus. And this is what I'd see as the central proposition, namely that God came down to earth in the person of Jesus Christ to rescue us humans from our moral mess. So we're in all sorts of difficulties in the world, many of them of our own making. And the good news of the nativity is that God has come to sort this out in the person of Jesus Christ. So that's really what I think is central. Now, in terms of analyzing things, we've got 4 sources about Jesus's life, which are biographies. I give you the number of words that they have. And we actually have 4 sources for the most famous person at the time of Jesus. That's the Roman Emperor Tiberius. And it's really amazing that Jesus, who is supposed to be a carpenter from a small town of Nazareth, should have as many books about him as the Roman Emperor. And it's in the 2 longer ones that I put in red, Matthew and Luke, that you actually have a nativity account, namely an account of Jesus's birth. And so we're going to dig down into those, and they've got some common elements in these 2 accounts. One is the idea of God coming. Matthew puts it, you call Jesus Emmanuel, which means God with us. Luke talks about Jesus as the Son of God. They also talk about him as a rescuer, a savior. They talk about him, both accounts, of him being born, not through a sexual encounter between the Virgin Mary and God, but a non-sexual coming upon of the Holy Spirit, bringing about this really weird thing of someone being born to a virgin. This happens in both accounts in Bethlehem and in the time of King Herod the Great. Well, you might say, well, that's fine, but if we got 2 accounts and they are so similar, surely one is just copied from the other and we don't have 2 independent witnesses. Well, what's interesting about these 2 accounts is just how different they are from each other. In fact, some people, and maybe in the Q&A, you'll bring this up, find that there are differences between them. They say, well, how can those 2 things both be true? So I just want to point out some of the differences in the account. In a Christmas reading, quite commonly when you hear about a decree going out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should have a census or be taxed, that's in Luke's gospel. And in Luke, and it doesn't mention this in Matthew, a specific talk about how they travel, this is Mary and Joseph, to travel to Bethlehem for the census, and that's where Jesus is born. Matthew just says it happens in Bethlehem. Then in Matthew's account, there's talk about wise men or magi following a star from the east and coming to visit Jesus. In Luke's account, it talks about shepherds. So those are some differences. Of course, you can have both. Then in Matthew's account, there on the left, Mary and Joseph have to flee to Egypt, which isn't actually that far from Bethlehem, but they have to flee there to get out of Herod's grip because he's killing the young babies nearby. And in Luke's account, it doesn't mention that. It simply has Jesus dedicated in Jerusalem and then going up north. And then finally, they both have genealogies of Jesus, and Jesus' legal father is Joseph, and then the generation above that, they actually have 2 different fathers for Joseph. So if one copied from each other, then it's really weird that they should be like this. And I think a lot of people say these are independent accounts of the life of Jesus. And we can go into some of those differences. Of course, it's easy to imagine how people can have 2 fathers, one a legal father and a biological father. We can go into that. But the big stumbling block for many people is this idea, can we believe in the virgin birth? And in some ways, that question is a bit like this. How can this poor little doggy get through the fence? And when people hear Christians saying, oh, I believe in a virgin birth, they're thinking, well, what you're trying to do is get me to believe in something definitely very weird that isn't going to fit into the way I see the world. We don't generally see miracles as we walk up and down the street. Why on earth should I accept this sort of thing? It doesn't seem to fit. And so as they understand it, Christians are asking people to believe in something weird, like pixies, fairies, whatever it is. And that's what the virgin birth is in the same category. And I just want to explain that when Christians talk about this, they aren't actually talking about something that is weird in a unique way, but actually that miracles in the Bible are not random. They actually make a pattern. And the pattern is about Jesus. And that when Jesus, you read the stories about Jesus, it's not that he is disturbing the patterns of what we know normally from science. He's actually making a pattern. So Christians believe that miracles occur in signal making patterns, meaningful patterns. And I do want to explain a bit about that. You see, Jesus is not just a completely random dude. He's actually a rather remarkable figure when you study him. He comes from this remarkable people group, the Jews, who, despite being a small population on earth, have done huge numbers of things in history. 43% of Nobel Prizes for economics have gone to Jews, which is just phenomenal. And in chemistry, similar things can be said. Also, he's coming at a time when the Jews have already got scriptures. You can go to a synagogue near you and ask the Jews what their scriptures are, and you go to the beginnings of those, and right from the beginning, the moment humans mess things up, God is promising a deliverer as soon as they rebel. And then through those scriptures, there's a narrative that follows where God gets more and more specific about the sort of deliverer he's going to send. And Christians see this as building up towards Jesus. So in fact, it's not that we're asking people to believe in a random miracle, but actually something that has been prepared for, and lots of things are fitting with. Now, the early Christians are called, guess what? Christians. Not a big surprise. Christian is a weird word because it's got the Hebrew word Messiah in. They're called that because the early Christians were Jews who believed the Messiah had come, that is the promised Jewish deliverer. And in fact, almost certainly, even on secular history, Jesus was believed to be the promised Jewish deliverer by a lot of people before he died, because that's the very best explanation for why on earth he would have been put to death by the Romans, because probably they don't like the idea that there might be some other king around. Also, it seems he chose 12 disciples, which is not just a random number, it's a meaningful number. There were 12 tribes of Israel, so he seems to have understood that. It seems he really was born in Bethlehem. We'll look at some evidence of that in a minute. It seems he really was born of a particular narrow family line going back to the King David. It's agreed that he died in Jerusalem, which is the capital of this remarkable people group. It's also agreed that he died at the time of their greatest festival. You can find that in Jewish sources outside the Christian ones. Now, about 2 billion people would say they're followers of Jesus, and would say not only all of these things about Jesus, but also that his life and his teaching is a meaningful message. It does seem he's the first one ever to be credited with the golden rule, which is the rule which says, do unto others what you would have them do to you. It's a remarkably wise thing to say for life. And the very first time it's recorded as said by Jesus. No one else in all the ancient texts, and I've read a lot of ancient texts, has said that thing before. There are also brilliant stories that come from his mouth. Stories like the parable of the prodigal son or the good Samaritan, stories that have been very powerful, and they arise at exactly the same time as him. His earliest disciples record them and say he said them. So that's a rather remarkable thing. He's also credited with more miracles than anyone else at the time. And get this, he comes into a world where Jews only believe there is one God, and yet his earliest followers, who were Jews, became convinced that he was God who made the universe. Now, that's a really weird thing. You see, convincing a whole load of Greeks who believe in loads of gods that you're God, they think, well, yes, we can have more gods. I mean, I was watching a couple of Percy Jackson films earlier in the week, and yes, they can have extra gods all the time, but Jews, you can't. You only ever have one God. So it's really stunning if you can convince a whole load of Jews that you are God. His words show unique patterns. You can actually study them linguistically and show that the things that it said he said in the accounts about him are different from the narrative roundabout. And it seems that not only did he die, but lots of people claimed that they had seen him risen from the dead, and his tomb was empty, no one's found a body, and his whole life correlates with prophecy. So all of that is just to say, and I could add more, it's not just that we're asking people to believe a random thing, but actually something that's meaningful, and Christians are saying this all makes sense together. Just a couple of texts to look at. This is a text from the Old Testament. That's the bit of the Bible written before Jesus. You could find this in any Jewish synagogue in England. You could go along, ask for the book of Isaiah, and get to chapter 9. And what you would find is this set of words I put in red. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be on his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Well, what's odd about that? Well, the odd thing is this. This was written hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus. Everyone agrees on that. And you can actually find copies of this from before Jesus. And it talks about a child being born who is called Mighty God. Now, go to Mecca, go to Riyadh, somewhere like that, and which is a monotheistic culture, mainly Islamic culture. They believe in one God, and go and stand on a street corner and say, God has been born as a child. Well, it's going to be a fairly risky thing to do. It's not going to work out well, because actually that would get a real reaction in that culture, I would predict. But isn't it astounding that in the text of this group of people, the Jews, who believe there's only one God, you would have a set of words like this, written hundreds of years before Jesus. So that's a thing that needs to be explained. Jesus makes sense of this text. One more. This is, again, a text written hundreds of years before Jesus. You could find in any synagogue in Britain or anywhere else. And it talks about the town of Bethlehem. But you are Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, for from you shall come forth for me one who's going to be a ruler in Israel. And then it adds this weird bit, who's coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. Well, hang on. So it's talking about a child in the future who's going to be born, and yet saying this child has origins from a long time before, which fits amazingly well if it's actually talking about God coming to earth, and in the whole context, it makes a lot of sense. Now, people might say, well, couldn't it be that the Gospels make up the bit about Jesus being born in Bethlehem in order to fit with the prophecy? So you write the fulfillment in order to fit with the prophecy. A problem with this is that Jesus actually became quite famous early on, and the Jesus following movement grew and grew and grew in just a few decades, so that there are then large numbers of people who are actually dying for their faith in different parts of the Roman Empire. Now, the problem is this. If you want to say that after the Jesus story had been going for quite a few years, people then added the idea that he was born in Bethlehem, that's going to be really difficult, because you've got lots of Jesus followers. Presumably they've heard something about where Jesus came from before their belief. That's not going to work very easily. Actually, it makes the best sense if that belief that he was born in Bethlehem comes from the beginning. And in fact, we know from secular history, this is a Jewish writer talking about one of Jesus's brothers, and how he was leader of a group and gets actually killed because of his religious belief. And it seems that he was a follower of Jesus, his own brother. When you have family members around, I'm a younger brother, I still know where my older brothers were born. The idea that you can simply change the birthplace of the leader of this movement at an early stage or a later stage doesn't make a lot of sense. So all of these are things to say that I think it makes a lot of sense that the nativity stories are not nonsense. Just one more thing as I close, and that is I've actually written a little article last Christmas in the magazine of the organisation I head up called Tinderhouse, tinderhouse.com. You can see the magazine there, and you can read an article there about objections to the Christmas stories. So I've taken quite a bit of time, but that's what I had to share. And back over to you now.
Thanks, Nick. So, Peter, just as people, we've got some questions coming in already. Do be tapping out your questions so that we can take this conversation in the way that you want to. But just to push back on one thing, you talked a lot about the sort of ancient prophecy side of things, but
yep.
we're still left with a virgin birth, which neatly fits perhaps the prophecies made hundreds of years before,
yep.
but still is asking us to believe something that is scientifically speaking very difficult to believe.
Yep.
Many would say impossible to believe.
Yep.
So the fact that somebody wrote about something 600, 700 years before doesn't necessarily get you off the hook, does it?
Well, I think I want to talk about beauty at this point. What makes us believe certain scientific theories? One of the key criteria is their beauty. So one of the things that makes a simple explanation and scientifically a better one is because it's more beautiful. And what I think a lot of people see is they say, well, we got these rules of science, the laws of nature. And what Christians are actually doing is that, and others who believe in miracles, they're asking us to spoil all of those patterns by believing in something weird, like a haunted house or whatever it is. And so Christians are coming along and saying, actually, there's this weird thing I want you to stick on to your sets of views about the laws of nature. What I think Christians are saying is, no, we don't want you to stick on a weird anomaly. Like, you can explain everything else, and I'm asking you to have this fuzzy bit of thinking at this. We are able to process signals intelligently. So we're communicating at the moment person to person. And actually our main way of understanding the world is about persons. Science has its limits. Science does not tell us that people have any value. Science cannot tell us we should fight a virus. Only people can do that. Science can't even tell you that you should invest money in science, because science, there's no scientific experiment to give you a value to science. It just can't be done. So in other words, there are other things that we need to think about, meaning of life questions that science can't answer. And what Christians are saying is that Jesus is God's personal message to us, and that his life is making a message. So it's not a bit of weirdness, it's actually a pattern that's being made. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay. So there you are, sitting in University of Cambridge, lots of intelligent people, lots of intelligent historians around. And when I did history, most of my lecturers weren't Christians, would have used their historical nous to come to these accounts and conclude that they didn't happen. So if the majority of historians would not line up with you, then why don't they line up with you? And what are the best arguments that you've come across that are in opposition to the position that you take?
Yes, well, I mean, I think firstly, you've got to be very careful about the whole questions of majorities, because of course we know that in the 1930s, the majority of scientists in America, Britain, and Germany were into eugenics and so on. So that's one thing, and majorities can change. In terms of the biggest objections, I think the biggest objections are really what you're articulating, which is the entire worldview of naturalism, the idea that we can just explain everything that way, against the entire Christian view, which I think needs to be taken together. And these are alternative ways of viewing reality. I think the Christian view as a whole has a whole lot more going for it. But I think that's, people interpret the world within a certain framework, and that's what's going on. And so for some people, it wouldn't matter how much testimony there is, they say they wouldn't believe in a miracle. Now, I think that's not quite the case, because we can see actually with lots of films, whether it's E.T. or superhero films or whatever it is, the experience presented to us as plausible, that someone goes from believing that there aren't superheroes to believing that there are. And we go along with that narrative because we can see at a certain point the evidence becomes so overwhelming for the character in the film that they need to believe different things about the universe than they might have believed before. In the same way, I think there's a whole overwhelming amount of evidence for Christianity, from the meaning of life through to historical evidences and prophecies, and particularly the way the whole message makes sense of the world, which together can be overwhelming.
You mentioned historical evidence a couple of times. Let's go into that in a bit more detail. So we've got King Herod, who some sources think died in about 4 BC. Obviously, it might be dying in 4 BC, to use our way of counting. The only census we know of that Quirinius organized was in 6 AD or CE. So how can Herod have been alive at the time of the census, which it seems took place after his death? Is there any evidence anywhere outside of the Bible accounts that there were censuses where you had to go back to a town that you didn't actually live in? And given that there was apparently a massacre of the innocents in Bethlehem, where everybody under 2 was, or all boys under 2 were killed, wouldn't we expect to see some kind of account of that outside of the biblical text? So a lot of historical questions.
A lot of questions there. Great.
Some of my questions, Peter, some have come up on the chat. So can you just speak to those?
So what I'd start with the whole questions of censuses. Let's think. We're in the Roman Empire. What is the point of being Roman Emperor? Well, you want as much power as you can, and you really can't do that without money. And so what you want to do is the whole purpose of building an empire is to squeeze as much as you can possibly out of your subjects. And how can you do that other than by taxation? And how can you do decent taxation without knowing how many people there are? So in fact, one of the things we know is that Romans were actually very keen on counting people. Caesar Augustus tells us in his own narrative of his life that he took 3 censuses of the citizens, but we also know that the ones that he records are not the only ones that happened. So for instance, there's an inscription which talks about a census taken up in the north of Syria, near the river Orontes, that was taken up, and that isn't mentioned in Augustus' own account. So there's a lot we'd like to know more about taxation. The main taxation records that actually survive are from Egypt, where it's dry, and so the actual papyri survive, and they go house to house, and they actually record how old people are and how big the house is, and these sort of things, because they're looking to get money out of people. So the objection can be, well, how on earth? So it says in Luke's Gospel, decree went out from Caesar Augustus. Where's a copy of this decree? Well, let's remember, the entire account we have of Augustus' own life by himself only ever talks about money that he gave to people. The whole thing is, I gave it this, I gave that. You would think the guy never took any money from anyone. So you've got selective reports there. So I'd say, actually, what Luke says about a census makes an awful lot of sense. Is there any evidence that people actually went to their own homes to be taxed? Well, there is, again, a record from Egypt from the year 104. I can put a link in chat at the end if people like, where, and it might be, no, it's not in my book, but where people did have to go home. Because you think about it, if you could just say, oh, the taxman's coming along, I'm going to head off to the next village, that wouldn't be really good. So actually, you need everyone to grass on their neighbors to make sure, who actually lives here, who's supposed to live here. Now, at the time of the census, you've got the Romans are in overall charge, but they've got this local king dude called Herod the Great, and he is great, but he's still under Caesar. And so any taxation that was taken would be taken via him. And the Jewish way of counting people was always according to their tribes. In the Old Testament, that was the way you did it. And the final question you had
was to do with the account in Matthew's Gospel where Herod has all the boys
children.
under 2
Okay.
Try and get rid of Jesus.
I mean, one thing we do know is that Herod was paranoid. There's a historian called Josephus that is the main source for Herod's life, and he killed his favorite wife at one stage and really regretted it. He had quite a few.
As you would, yeah.
Yeah, because he thought she was plotting. He killed several of his sons and so on. And it will talk about massacres fairly readily. But, it's a bit like Stalin. We don't know all of who Stalin murdered to within the nearest few million, because it was just such a common thing. So the thought that if all the children in Bethlehem and the area around who are under 2, which might just have been 20 or 30 children, would necessarily get in a record other than the Gospels, I think is a bit optimistic. There aren't loads and loads of records sloshing around of every little thing that happened. Vast numbers of people have been lost from history or historical records in the last decade on this planet. So actually, I don't think that's going to happen.
You've mentioned Josephus a few times.
Yep.
You did in the last answer. A Jewish guy, sort of historian, writing sort of Roman propaganda after the Jewish Roman War in AD 70, and Christians tend to use Josephus quite a lot. We sort of like him because he's not a Christian, but he's talking about the events. But it seems, I think most historians, I don't know where you'd stand, but most historians accept that there are later interpolations, presumably by Christian scribes. And so some of what he said, he may not actually have said in the first place. So how, doesn't that need to make us a bit nervous about using these ancient texts? The bits that you've lent on Josephus for, are they parts that are sort of doubted by the academy? And then I suppose the bigger question is, if Josephus can get sort of tweaked and changed and become a bit unreliable in places, what's to say that the Gospels haven't had the same thing done to them?
Yeah, great question. And I should have just said, I mean, you asked about books I'd written. I didn't write the New Testament, but I do. I am the associate editor of Cambridge University Press's Greek New Testament. So I have done a little bit of work on the Greek text. In fact, that's the bit I know a little bit more about. Let's put it like this. How many of us could write decent 17th century English? Just, a paragraph of that. How many of us could even write decent 19th century English so that it'd be really convincing? Like, just over 100 years ago, we'd really struggle. And so
I struggle to write in decent 21st century English.
Yeah. So how on earth is a monk or some Christian forger hundreds of years after Josephus supposed to write the sort of Greek that Josephus would write? It's going to be spotted a mile off. It's just not really possible. And even though we've now got lots of tools that help us analyze language, so actually you can do far better forgeries now, this just doesn't work. And the other thing is that we've got to remember, how do we know anything about classical literature? The reason we know about classical literature is not because the Greeks and the Romans preserved it. It's because Christian scribes in the Middle Ages preserved it, including the dirty Greek plays and all the rest. It was monks who passed on all of these sorts of things to us. So, and from different countries. And the good thing is, you can't say that all the monasteries in Ireland were collaborating with all of the monasteries in Germany or Italy and so on. It just doesn't make sense historically. There's never been any Pope Emperor who's been able to be in charge of all of the text production across the world. So the idea that people could change things and that wouldn't be spotted is just doesn't make a lot of sense. So we got thousands of manuscripts of ancient texts and of the Bible, and they can all be studied. And in fact, I've got photos of all of the papyri from ancient Egypt. We've got photos of them all, 50 yards behind me. Everyone can check those things out, and there are lots of people poring over that all the time. So I think the idea that it can all just get changed doesn't make a lot of sense.
So another question coming in, which is probably helpful to lead on to from that. You were talking earlier about these ancient prophecies that have been handed on down through this the history of this special people, the Jewish nation, from hundreds of years before, which locate the coming of the Messiah in a particular birthplace, which actually describe a lot of what he's going to do when he's grown up. And you're suggesting that the Nativity sort of fits the blueprint, as it were, that's described in those prophecies. So why, when Jesus does come along and fits the blueprint, apparently, why do the vast majority of the Jewish nation decide that actually he isn't the Messiah? such that the Romans can crucify him without there being too much disruption and no rioting, and why all through the rest of the last 2,000 years, why is it that Jews don't believe in Jesus as the Messiah?
Well, I mean, what I'd say is, firstly, a lot do. And so amongst the earliest Christians, I mean, all of Jesus' disciples were Jews, and large numbers of people came to faith. And according to the book of Acts in the New Testament, large numbers of priests came to faith. And there are different reasons why some people don't believe. Some people have heard and reject the message, and many people have not heard, or they've just heard a rumor and they might have rejected the rumor rather than the real deal. So I think that there's all of that going on. But I would want to say that whether people accept or reject can be based on true hearing or actually not wanting to hear. But sometimes there's an in-between category where people have heard a bit and haven't had it clearly presented enough. I think in a lot of ways, Britain's like that, where the problem in Britain is a lot of people think they know Christianity because it's sort of been kicking around in Britain for a while, and they actually haven't. They've actually been inoculated against Christianity because they got a sort of bit of Christianity rammed down their throat at school or whatever it was, and they haven't actually encountered the real deal. And when they do encounter it, they think, "Wow, that's amazing." The other aspect is that when it comes to believing, humans don't like to believe that someone else would be in charge of them. And so the idea that God's in charge of us is rather threatening. And the idea that God himself has come into the world and communicated in the person of Jesus Christ can be very threatening as well.
Okay, let's think a bit more about the gospel writers. You talked about Matthew and Luke, and is there a possibility that we take a rather sort of modernist approach to what they thought they were doing? By which I mean, we think of, or the popular view of what historians are doing is writing things down that actually happened in the way that they actually happened, as clearly and unbiasedly as possible. You're sort of saying that that's what Matthew and Luke are trying to do, but these are first century writers. Why would we not just sort of think these are men who are writing inspiring legends? There may be some kernel of historical truth in there, but who's to say that they thought they were writing down what actually happened in the way that we think of sort of accurate history?
Yeah, well, I think reality matters to every age. So, reality about the virus matters to us, and political reality mattered a lot. So you could have a town crier in the Middle Ages. You could have gatekeepers who would tell you what was going on. And actually, this is important in every age. Who won such and such a battle? Who's in charge now? These things matter. And the way Luke introduces his gospel is like this: inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of all the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have the certainty concerning the things that you've been taught. So he's writing a dedication to a high up Roman called Theophilus, and he says, I'm doing this so you can have confidence about things. So in other words, it seems to be presenting itself as a factual account. I would say the same with Matthew, that he does seem concerned about history, what happens in what order. Those things are in the narrative.
I want to come back to that in a moment, but lots of people have been asking great questions about angels. So I want to try and, this is possibly slightly tangential to whether the accounts are trustworthy, but what is an angel? Are angels the kind of angels that pop up in the New Testament Gospels? Are they the same as the angels who appear from time to time in the Old Testament? And what's an angel's relationship to God or to to the divine being? Just if you can just give us 1 minute that just slams that
angel just means messenger, and one of the great things I study languages is that it's one of those words that traveled. So Greek angelos, Latin angelus, and English angel, and you go about just about every European language, the word for angel will sound the same, but it is the word in original meaning. It's the word messenger, and they don't necessarily have wings like on our Christmas cards. They're actually people who announce from God. They're often described as looking like people. But they are divine messengers. So I think God has many beings that He's created, and He sends these ones to communicate to humans.
Okay, that was very good for a 1 minute answer. Thank you. Let's move on to another potentially miraculous, difficult to believe aspect, which is the star that the wise men follow. So we've got a star appearing that they seem to decide must mean that the King of the Jews has been born, and then it moves around, which might be difficult for cosmologists. And then we've got it leading these wise men of indeterminate number from an indeterminate place to the Bethlehem birthplace. So how do you explain this star? And isn't it a rather strange, like, why does Matthew include that when he's meant to be writing about what happened, in terms of Old Testament prophecy being fulfilled?
So one of the things got to recognize over time is that we've changed the meaning of star. So just as value-added tax is now at 20%, but I remember when it was 17.5 and then 15, and the things change over time. We've actually changed the meaning of star, so it's now the big ball in the sky. But for earlier generations, when they were just simply, they could only look out from the Earth, and they couldn't do some of the fancy scientific things we could do. Planets were stars. In fact, the word planet, it just means wanderer, but originally the phrase was wandering stars. So just as we have shooting stars that we know aren't the same as what we call stars, and you also, a comet can be a star. So I think there are various things that could be the Star of Bethlehem, and people have talked about the supernova, triple planetary conjunction, if you like, and a comet, all of which can be such things. And I've had people do wonderful presentations for me showing how these things actually work on the skyline of Bethlehem. I was looking at one recently, and that's all very well, but we don't have anything definite that we, provable or agreed. And it slightly depends on what year you put Jesus being born anyway, and that's debated. So, but I don't think there's any difficulty with the thought that something that's bright and up in the sky is able to go such that from an observer's perspective, it comes and points them to the particular place to go. Why would God do such a thing? What he does is he shows how people come a very long way. They come from the east, as is said by prophecy that they would, to worship a king. And I think this is an amazing celestial phenomenon, because it's saying this is more than just a bit of local news. This is actually something that involves the whole world, because we all look up at roughly the same sky. I know that we don't see the Southern Cross from here, but we all see what's up there. And so Babylonians were famous for observing things in the sky. Other groups as well out in the east, and I think that's what it's showing, is that the king has come.
Okay, let's go back to where we were before the angels question, which is to do with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John writing these biographies of Jesus that you're saying are that they were trying to write down what actually happened, or at least Luke is claiming to write down what actually happened. I imagine you would want to date these as being written, you know, but by those four individuals in the 1st century, so fairly early on, before Christianity has had a chance to spread throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. So, and this is, I suppose, coming more onto your book, Can We Trust the Gospels, than strictly on is the Nativity Nonsense. But here are four guys who are Christians. They have a lot to gain from the spread of Christianity. They have a lot to gain from having their time not wasted by Christianity proving not to be true. So isn't there just a psychological sort of impulse for them to, shall we say, massage the facts to put the best spin on it, or even just to make things up, particularly as they are attempting to convince Jews and everybody, Jews who thought crucifixion would be an abomination for God to go through, and Romans who wouldn't even mention crucifixion because it was so shameful. Isn't there a great sort of psychological onus on them to have decided that the resurrection, for example, did happen, must have happened, because that gives credence to a message that otherwise is a very weak and debunked message? In other words, I'm saying, why don't you think that these four guys, or the four communities that came up with the Gospels, were selective with the facts at best, or deliberately trying to shore up a position that they had already committed to?
Yeah, well, I think firstly, of course, all sorts of people with particular agendas can bury ugly facts and all sorts of things like that, and we've all got to watch ourselves about that. But what I would say is that, you know, there's no financial gain in being a Christian early on in the 1st century. It's likely to shorten your life. There's a lot going against it, and inventing a resurrection doesn't make your narrative more plausible to people, because in fact most of the Romans believe that after you've lived your life and you die, then you might go to a sort of spiritual world, a world of thought, but not something fleshly, and the idea of a body actually coming back physically is a bit gross for them. So it's not something easy to think why they'd make up. Or could you say, oh yes, well, it's the way, you know, people go into denial about bereavement, and so that's why they do it. But again, it doesn't really explain why you'd have this group of people traveling far and wide, suffering, simply because they couldn't let go of their dear Jesus. You know, if you were really not wanting to let go of him, best thing is not to let him get crucified in the first place. But this idea that you would then have them in their own account abandoning him to get crucified by the Romans, and then deciding that they were going to stick by him forever despite the odds, doesn't make as much sense as the narrative that the Gospels do give, that they abandoned him in their weakness, he rose again, and gave them the strength then to talk about him going forward. As for the issue of bias, I think you've got to be careful on this, because someone could accuse you of something really awful, and then imagine you have to appear in court in this, and they say, well, we're going to discount your testimony because you're biased to prove your own innocence. So we're just going to discount anything you or any of your friends have to say because they also like you. And so, of course, we all have biases and agendas, but sometimes you have a bias because you really believe in it. So I'm very biased to think that my parents are wonderful people. You know, even though they're no longer with us, I would defend their reputation vociferously, but I think I would do so on the basis of lots of evidence as well. So I think that passionate conviction doesn't have to trade off against rational argument.
Okay, so you say in your book, which is great, by the way, and I'm not saying this to you, I'm saying this to everybody else. It's well worth a read if you're interested in these things. But you say about 3/4 of the way through that by the end of this book, hopefully I will have demonstrated that trusting the Gospels is more rational than any of the alternatives. And I just wonder whether, if if I were a skeptic, I might think you've set the bar quite low for yourself there, because with the alternatives, I'm not being asked if, you know, if Jesus isn't the Son of God, if he didn't really rise, if he didn't die to take us out, rescue us from the mess that he said we're in. If one of the alternative explanations is true, then it doesn't need to have any impact on my life. I can just go to work, or indeed at the moment not go to work tomorrow, and off we go. Whereas if what you're saying is true, then of course that does have huge implications for my decisions and my life and my future, and how I spend my money and how I raise my kids and so on. So shouldn't the bar for you saying that the Gospels are trustworthy and that Jesus is true, shouldn't it be set rather higher than the bar for saying one of the alternatives is probably true?
Thank you. It's a great question. I mean, I'd say no. I mean, I think if you can prove that a particular view, or demonstrate that a particular view is the best explanation, the most rational one, why wouldn't you take it? And the other thing is, I could say, look, it may be very convenient for you to say that you are in charge of your life. And a Christian is arguing that actually your life is owned by your maker, God, who's kind, by the way. That can be something that could be jolly inconvenient. But I don't see why the bar of evidence should be any higher than that. And some people say, you know, they want some proof, and they mean some sort of mathematical proof. But hang on, you can't prove a whole load of things mathematically. I mean, you can't prove the value of anything mathematically. You just sort of start with your axioms and you work through to a demonstration, but that won't prove that you should. I mean, you can't prove mathematically you should get out of bed in the morning, and yet people do.
And often, Peter, I don't.
And anyone who works, puts any money or time into anything, has decided that it has value, and we are making those value decisions every day, every moment. And so, on what basis are those made? And we don't often people don't ask for proof that that particular decision is correct. And the other thing is, I know that the whole response to COVID is controversial, and you know, people have different views about that. But at the end of the day, I would have thought that any argument about COVID would be simply on what's the most rational on basis of the evidence we currently have. I mean, you can't get better than that. And whatever that would be, that's what you should do. So I think that when I'm commending Christianity, people, I'm saying, yes, this is, I believe, the most rational alternative there is. I mean, it goes beyond our minds. It stretches beyond our minds because we're talking about an infinite God. But it doesn't go against those minds because God made those minds.
Okay, so last question, because we've got to draw it to a close. But if there was someone watching this and they'd come in very dubious about the historical veracity of the nativity accounts, and they're leaving quite intrigued that they might actually be true, give us just your sort of 30-second Christian pitch for why it's worth somebody's time to wrestle with whether they really are true or not. In other words, what have they got to gain if it's true?
Well, you've got a vast number of hours in a typical life, and it only takes 9 hours to read or listen to the 4 Gospels. So I think you really should do that. It's a pretty small call, and I think that would be the best commendation I can. I'd say the person of Jesus is fascinating, remarkable, and the Christian message is that not only is he interesting, but he's also necessary, because we've messed up our lives, and he doesn't just come alongside us as a therapist and someone to advise us. He actually comes as our savior to rescue us, because in a lot of ways we are drowning in our own rebellion against God, and he's actually at very, very high personal cost done something about that. And if the Christian argument that he suffered more than you could possibly imagine because he loved you that much, If that's true, wouldn't you want to know about someone who loved you that much?
Well, time is drawing to a close. Just before I hand us back to Norman to close this event, I just want to tell you about a couple of books. The first is, if you want to keep thinking about these things and you want Peter to help you keep thinking about these things, then the one on the left, Can We Trust the Gospels? I can genuinely say it's the most readable of Peter's books, but it's also a very readable book in general. Doesn't take long. Good for reading between Christmas and New Year, and that bit where no one's quite sure what to do. If you go to thegoodbook.co.uk, you'll be able to buy a copy there, no problem. So if you want to keep thinking about whether we can really trust these ancient documents and what they say about this man, Jesus, who so many billions of people through history have thought is the king and the rescuer of the world and their personal savior and Lord, then I really would recommend that. If you're sort of reasonably persuaded that the nativity accounts may well be true and you'd like to know a bit more about, okay, well, why does that matter? Then the book on the right by J.D. Greer called Searching for Christmas, What If There's More to the Story Than You Thought, is a very short read. It's only 64 pages. And he actually takes one of those prophecies that Peter read out earlier from the book of Isaiah and just tracks through why it's great news, life-changing news and eternity-changing news if Jesus is the one who was prophesied by Isaiah. So 2 books that you might like to grab to recommend to you. But that's enough from me. Thanks very much for joining us. Norman, I'm going to hand back to you.
Well, thanks to Peter and to Carl for a fascinating evening. Lots to think about there. And thanks to the 7 local churches that collaborated to bring us this event. And hopefully you should be able to see the names and the web addresses of those churches on your screens. If you'd like to know more about this evening's subject or about how you can engage with the Christian heart of Christmas, then you could ask the person who invited you to this meeting, or perhaps check out the website of the nearest church to you from that list on your screen. For many of us, attending a carol service is a much loved fixture in our annual Christmas celebrations. Well, as you know, that's going to be a bit harder this year, but fear not. 2 evenings before Christmas, on Wednesday, the 23rd of December at 7:30 p.m., you can join with us in Carols from Your Couch, a joyous celebration for a time of COVID that does exactly what it says on the tin. Check the website of a participating church for details. That's Carols from Your Couch at 7:30 p.m. on Wednesday, the 23rd of December. It'll be lovely to see you there. Well, our evening is drawing to its close. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope you found it useful, interesting, and challenging. God bless you, and goodbye.